Hello, class. Okay, so today's lecture is going to be focused on a paper by Alan Krueger and Josh Angrist that uses the experience of young men who were exposed to the Vietnam War draft to try to estimate the effect of changes in education on workers' future earnings. So the reason this is important, the overarching question that we're trying to get at by looking at this is trying to estimate the return on investment that comes from investments in education. In other words, if we think of education as an investment, right? We think of people going to school in order to increase their earnings later. We might want to know, is spending your tuition dollars and your time acquiring education a better or a worse investment than earning money and putting it in the stock market or investing in businesses or other sorts of investment, right? Are human capital investments earning a higher or a lower return than physical capital investments? So just to be clear about what we mean here, when we talk about the return on investment, what we're normally going to mean is our return on investment is going to be something like the change in our future earnings from a change in human capital, right? Essentially the future benefit of human capital in ratio to our costs. So if we were thinking about a physical capital investment, right, I was going to put $100 in the stock market, I would say that my return on investment would be whatever I have when I pull my money out of the stock market divided by the $100 that I spent, right? In other words, the growth rate of my money. In this case, I want to think about the growth rate of my money in the same way by saying how much do I earn in the future? How do my future earnings change with human capital investment over how my present earnings change with human capital investment? Okay. So the reason that this is important is we can think about the importance of this from both a practical perspective and a theoretical perspective. From a practical perspective, the government spends a large amount of money trying to encourage students to obtain higher levels of education. Right? We spend something like $14,000 per student on K-12 education, and state and federal governments also subsidize higher education in a variety of ways, right? From providing Pell Grants to lower income students, to subsidizing in-state tuition, to providing students with student loans, right? All of which are designed to encourage students to obtain higher levels of education. So if we knew that the return on investment for education for most students of the next year of education they would obtain is high relative to the return on investment of other kinds of investments, we would probably want to essentially encourage education in all the ways that we could. We would want to spend more public money on education. We would want to encourage students to take out student loans. We would counsel students to obtain whatever education they thought would be valuable to them. On the other hand, if we thought that the return on investment in education was low relative to other kinds of investments, we might be a little bit more cautious about both spending public money on education and also encouraging students to go into debt in order to obtain education. So for a very practical perspective, this is going to be important. It's also going to be important from a theoretical perspective because we can learn something about how people make their education decisions by seeing what the return on investment in education is. So if you remember from our theory, right, these two things here, this change in future earnings with respect to age and change in present earnings with respect to age, in our simple models, we have said that our future earnings right, are just W2, and our present is something like W1 times 1 minus H, right? So we've modeled our education decision as essentially getting a wage in period 2 that's a function of how much human capital we invest in, and giving up some of the time that we could have spent earning money early on. And so our return on investment would just equal the change in W2, right, with respect to H over the change in W1 with respect to H. And because of the fact that we've generally taken W2 to be something like, let's say AH to the B, right, with B less than 1, we can take this and say that this is going to be something like AB times h to the b minus 1, right, over negative w1, right? And so what we're going to have is essentially benefits of education that are decreasing, costs of education that are constant. If we have an ability to borrow or save as much as we would like, what we're generally going to assume is that this is going to result in a change in benefits that looks like this, right? dw2 dh, and costs that are constant, right? If we think about this in present discounted value terms, we'd have costs that are something like minus w1 times 1 plus r, right? Because dollars today are going to be worth 1 plus r dollars tomorrow to us tomorrow, and we would choose an investment here. And so what this would tell us is that at this h, I'll call this hr, right? The return on investment in human capital would equal the return on investment in any other kind of capital, right? Return on investment would be dw2 dh over w1 and would equal 1 plus r. On the other hand, if students are credit constrained, or if they really don't like college, or if they don't understand the full value of college, they might stop investing sooner than that, in which case the rate of return on education would be higher than 1 plus r. And if they really, really love college, if it has all sorts of non-monetary benefits, right, like increasing your ability to make good health investments in yourself, increasing your quality of life because you get to read wonderful books that, you know, open your mind to the world, increasing your social status, all these sorts of things, we might end up with a return on investment that's lower than 1 plus r. Or on the other hand, right, if people are generally overestimating the benefits of college. So if, as researchers, we found a return on investment in education that's something like this, then, right, where it's above 1 plus r, that would generally lead us to believe either that credit constraints are an important part of people's education decisions, or that people are underestimating the value of education, both of which would lead us to think that we should encourage higher levels of education, right? Provide more public money, more student loans. If we found a return on investment like this, that would suggest either that there's important non-monetary benefits to education, in which case maybe we should encourage them if those non-monetary benefits are things that are of social value, right? Like being better citizens, better voters, making more informed consumer decisions, but maybe not if they're things that are really just of purely private value, right? Like college parties being really fun, or playing hacky sack on the quad being really fun. Or that people are overestimating the returns on investment in education, in which case we're generally going to think that we shouldn't try to subsidize more education. Okay, so where we're going to go from here is first I want to talk through the key empirical challenge that makes estimating the return on investment in education difficult, in particular that makes estimating the effect of education on workers' future earnings difficult. Then I'm going to talk about the strategy that this paper uses to get around those difficulties and why we might want to or not want to believe in their strategy. Then talk a little bit about what they find, and then finally think about how to interpret their findings in light of this broader question. How to contextualize their findings in terms of education policy, and also reasons we might be skeptical or not skeptical of those findings.